The forest in Slavic lands was never just a collection of trees. It was not passive scenery or background to daily life. It was a presence, ancient and alive, and in the imagination of the people who lived beside it, it was something that breathed and thought in ways humans could never fully understand. For farmers, hunters, and travelers, the forest stretched beyond the edge of their villages like a second world. The deeper you went, the more you stepped into a place where rules blurred and dangers multiplied. You could be lost within minutes, even if you knew the paths. The trees shifted, shadows looked like figures, voices echoed where no one stood. In the silence, your own heartbeat felt like an intruder. It was in this place that the stories of the Leshy began, and for those who believed in him, he was not just a character of myth. He was the forest itself, given a face and a will. The Leshy was said to be tall, sometimes as tall as the tallest pine, sometimes no bigger than a child. He could shrink or grow at will, and no one could be certain what he would look like if they encountered him. Sometimes he was described as a man with a green beard of moss and leaves, his skin rough and bark-like, his eyes burning with a strange gleam, half wild and half mocking. Other times he appeared almost human, dressed in hunter's garb, his clothing turned inside out or mismatched in strange ways, his movements jerky and unsettling. He was not bound to one form. To meet the Leshy was to meet something unstable, shifting, impossible to pin down. The uncertainty was part of the terror because how do you prepare for something when you cannot even decide what it looks like? People feared him, but they also respected him because he was not only a trickster who led wanderers to their doom, he was a ruler of the forest and its creatures. Every animal, from the smallest hare to the largest bear, was under his care. Hunters who took too much without showing proper respect would find themselves punished. Shepherds who led their flocks too deep into the trees risked losing them all, scattered by the Leshy's will. Yet those who honored him, who left offerings of bread or salt at the edge of the woods, might find that their hunts went well, their cattle thrived, and their journeys passed safely. In this way, he was both an enemy and a potential ally, a being who could not be simply classified as good or evil. Like the forest itself, he was dangerous because he was indifferent to human categories. He was wild, and wildness cannot be domesticated without consequence. What made the Leshy particularly frightening was his ability to deceive. Travelers would hear voices calling their names, the exact tones of their friends or family urging them to follow, a familiar whistle, a laugh, a mother's voice. All of it could be imitated perfectly. People would step off the path, pulled toward the sound, and soon they would find themselves hopelessly lost, sometimes never returning. Others told of the Leshy taking on the form of a loved one and walking beside them only for something to give him away. His shadow pointing in the wrong direction, his face slightly twisted, his feet reversed so that his tracks led the wrong way. These details became warnings repeated in every village. If someone looked like your brother but cast no shadow, it was the Leshy. If a man greeted you in the woods but his buttons were fastened backward, it was the Leshy. If you were called deeper into the forest by your friend's voice when your friend was standing right beside you, it was the Leshy. Children grew up hearing these warnings, and adults remembered them with equal seriousness. The woods were not just dangerous because of wolves or bears, they were dangerous because of him. At the same time, he explained the inexplicable. Why did hunters vanish without a trace? Why did cattle stray and disappear in the thickets? Why did some wanderers walk in circles, passing the same tree again and again until they collapsed from exhaustion? These were not accidents. They were the Leshy's work. He was the explanation for the strangeness of the forest, a living embodiment of its unpredictability. But for all his cruelty, the Leshy was not only a destroyer, he could teach. In some stories, those who survived an encounter with him returned with a deeper understanding of the woods, knowledge of herbs, or skill in tracking animals. It was as though he decided whether to punish or reward, and no one could predict which way it would go. A hunter might be mocked and harassed for days, his sense of direction scrambled, before suddenly being guided to a rich hunting ground, as if to show that survival depended not just on skill, but on humility. Another might be granted safe passage because he left an offering or whispered a prayer. The Leshy was fickle, yes, but also bound to certain patterns. He was not chaotic without reason. He represented the balance between human need and the forest's power, and when that balance was broken, he stepped in to correct it. Travelers often said that time itself felt strange under his influence. You could walk for what felt like hours and find you had traveled no distance at all. Or you could step off the path for a moment and return to find a whole day had passed. This sense of dislocation was part of his realm, and in many ways, it mirrored the psychological experience of being lost in the wild. Panic set in, logic faded, and reality itself seemed to bend. The Leshy was the personification of this state of being, a trickster who could bend perception as easily as a branch. Those who wanted to protect themselves against him carried iron, crosses, or charms. Some would turn their clothing inside out before entering the forest, confusing him with his own tricks. Others made signs of respect at the threshold between field and trees, acknowledging that they were stepping from the human world into his. Superstition grew around the smallest details. If the wind shifted suddenly, people whispered it was him moving through the trees. If animals grew restless for no reason, the Leshy was near. Silence in the forest, too deep and unnatural, was another sign. The line between natural observation and supernatural fear blurred completely, because in truth, the Leshy was both. The stories that spread across villages made him a figure impossible to ignore. Everyone knew someone who had been lost in the woods, and everyone could point to tales of those who never returned. The Leshy was the face given to that loss, but he was also the reminder of something larger. Humans did not truly rule the land. They cleared fields and built homes, but beyond their fences the old powers remained, and the Leshy was one of the greatest among them. His existence reminded people of humility, respect, and the danger of arrogance when stepping into the realm of the untamed. When we move deeper into these stories, we see that the Leshy is never portrayed the same way twice. Sometimes he is a giant striding above the treetops. Sometimes he is a small man with laughter in his eyes. Sometimes he looks like your closest companion. This instability is not weakness. It is part of his essence. To be the Leshy is to be changeable, as unpredictable as the forest itself. Just as a sunny day can turn to storm without warning, just as a clear path can vanish into thicket, so too does the Leshy alter his form. He is consistency through inconsistency, the single truth being that he cannot be trusted to remain the same. It is in this unstable form that we begin to understand the first true character of the Leshy, because while Baba Yaga tests those who approach her with impossible tasks, the Leshy tests them by destabilizing their very senses. To meet him is to lose your bearings, to doubt your own eyes and ears. His trial is not one of labor, but of perception. The human mind, so confident in what it sees and hears, finds itself undone in his presence. And so his realm is not simply the trees and animals, but the very boundaries of reality. This is what makes him terrifying, not his teeth or claws, he often has none, but his ability to twist certainty itself until nothing feels safe. From here, the accounts begin to branch. In one tale, he appears as a laughing prankster, leading travelers astray only to return them unharmed, shaken but alive. In another, he is merciless, luring entire herds of cattle into ravines or lakes, destroying livelihoods overnight. Some stories show him married, with a wife who is his equal in power, and children who run wild through the trees. Others leave him solitary, a lonely ruler whose tricks come from isolation. The variety is not contradiction. It is the mark of a figure so old, so deeply woven into folklore, that he carries different faces for different needs. And it is from these scattered fragments, these warnings and tales, that we must begin to draw out the deeper meaning of the Leshy. If he is the forest given voice, then we must ask what the forest meant to those who lived within reach of its power. Only then can we understand why they imagined a guardian, a trickster, and a ruler who could never be tamed. If the Leshy was known for anything beyond his tricks, it was his gift of shape-shifting. This was not a simple disguise worn to confuse a traveler, but an endless mutability, a fluidity of form that made him impossible to grasp. In some tales he grew so tall his head touched the clouds, his stride carrying him over hills and rivers with ease. In others he shrank to the size of a blade of grass, slipping unnoticed between a wanderer's boots. He was said to be able to appear as a wolf, a bear, a hare, or even a bird, taking on whatever form suited his purpose. Sometimes he imitated a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes even a familiar companion. To meet him was to confront the uncertainty of vision itself, because the Leshy was never what he first appeared to be. This ability was not treated as a mere trick in the old stories. It was bound to the very essence of what the forest represented. In the woods, nothing was stable. Shadows shifted with the wind, a fallen tree became a beast in the corner of the eye, branches creaked and moved like living things. The Leshy was that instability embodied. He was the idea that in the wilderness, appearances cannot be trusted. A trail might look clear and lead you in circles. A voice might sound kind and lead you to ruin. The Leshy's shape-shifting gave a face to this reality, making the forest not just dangerous, but intelligent in its deception. Accounts from villagers described him appearing in recognizable forms, but always with some flaw that betrayed him. He might look like a woodsman, but his belt was tied the wrong way. He might smile like a neighbor, but his teeth were sharp and irregular. His shadow might point east while the sun set in the west. His footprints might run backward, making pursuit impossible. These details were retold with great seriousness because they were warnings. People needed to know how to recognize him before it was too late. The Leshy never came as himself because his true form was ungraspable, too much for the human mind to pin down. Instead, he borrowed appearances, each one a mask covering the wild force beneath. Hunters in particular feared this power. They relied on their senses to track game, to follow trails, to read the signs of animals. The Leshy's interference turned these skills against them. Tracks in the snow could suddenly twist and vanish, leading nowhere. The cry of a stag could echo from all directions at once. Hunters who thought they were following deer might find themselves chasing illusions until exhaustion overtook them. In the Leshy's forest, their skills became meaningless. And yet, the stories also tell of moments when he guided them instead, shifting into the form of a bird that flew ahead, leading them toward abundant game. Just as he could deceive, he could also provide, depending on whether he judged the hunter worthy of the forest's gifts. The shape-shifting was not only about deception, it was also a symbol of mastery. To change shape at will was to be unconstrained, unbound by the limits of form that defined every other creature. Humans were trapped in their bodies, their appearances fixed. Animals, too, were bound to their natures. But the Leshy could be all of them, slipping between categories with ease. This freedom made him terrifying because he represented a way of being that humans could not achieve. He was not one thing, but all things at once. And that made him untouchable. It was said that if you wandered far enough into the woods and encountered a giant striding above the trees, you were seeing the Leshy in his most primal form. His laughter shook the branches, and his steps cracked the earth. He was the forest itself made flesh, tall and incomprehensible, a reminder of the scale of nature compared to human smallness. Other times, though, he appeared as a small child, laughing and mischievous, darting between roots and stones. This duality captured the two faces of the wilderness. It could overwhelm with vastness, or it could trip you up with the smallest of obstacles. The Leshy was both extremes at once. Farmers who took their cattle into the forest told stories of the Leshy appearing as one of the animals, blending in with the herd. He would lead them astray, scattering them deep into the woods. Sometimes the farmer could recover them, sometimes not. In these stories, the Leshy was not just a trickster, but a herdsman of his own, keeping claim over the animals of the wild and punishing those who took too much from the forest without respect. His shape-shifting allowed him to move among the beasts unseen, their secret master hidden in plain sight. There were also tales of the Leshy taking the form of wind and storm. Travelers would speak of sudden gales rising out of nowhere, trees bending and creaking, branches snapping in violent gusts. The storm was his laughter, they said, and the force that sent travelers stumbling was his hand. To see a whirlwind whip up dust and leaves was to glimpse the Leshy moving past, invisible yet unmistakably present. His shape-shifting was not limited to the forms of living beings, it extended to the very elements, making him not just master of animals, but master of the forces of the forest itself. This ability to take any shape was not without its limits, according to some accounts. He could mimic human form, but never perfectly. There was always something wrong, something uncanny. His shadow betrayed him, or his reflection failed to appear in water. His voice might sound too hollow or too booming. These flaws were crucial because they gave people a way to defend themselves. Without them, he would be impossible to resist. The warnings embedded in folklore, the backward clothing, the reversed footprints, were survival tools, ways to recognize that the person standing beside you might not be who you thought they were. What makes the shape-shifting so fascinating is how it mirrors the experience of the forest itself. Anyone who has walked deep in the woods knows how quickly things can seem to change. Light shifts, landmarks vanish, a path you thought you knew looks unfamiliar. The mind begins to play tricks, seeing shapes where there are none, hearing voices in the rustling leaves. The Leshy's mutability was a way of explaining this disorienting effect. He was not only the ruler of the forest, but the forest's very instability, given form and intention. By giving the shifting forest a master, people gave their fear a name, something to blame, something to respect. The Leshy's ability to transform also placed him in a category with other shape-shifting beings of European folklore, but with a crucial difference. Where werewolves or vampires were bound to certain cycles or conditions, the Leshy's transformations were constant and voluntary. He was not cursed or compelled. He chose his forms as easily as a man chooses his clothes. This freedom elevated him above other monsters, making him less a creature of punishment and more a force of nature. He did not shift because he had to, but because it was his essence. To be the Leshy was to be fluid, changing beyond the reach of fixed definition. Some stories suggested that humans could also become like him, though only briefly. A person who entered into a pact with the Leshy might gain the ability to shift their form, but always at a cost. These individuals were feared, treated as witches or sorcerers, because their connection to the Leshy made them part of his domain. They were no longer entirely human. In these accounts, the Leshy's shape-shifting was not only a symbol of his power, but a temptation, a forbidden gift that lured people away from their proper place. To take it was to cross a line, to become too close to the wild. The very unpredictability of the Leshy's form meant that stories about him could be endlessly retold without contradiction. One village might describe him as a giant, another as a small man, another as a wolf, and all would be correct. His identity was multiple, a reflection of how the forest appeared differently to each who entered it. For one, it was vast and overwhelming. For another, it was small and treacherous. For all, it was deceptive. The Leshy's shape-shifting was not a flaw in the stories, but the very reason they endured. He could be whatever the teller needed him to be, whatever form captured the fear or respect the forest commanded. In this way, the Leshy's mutability became central to his role. He was not a static character with fixed traits. He was a living embodiment of the unknown, constantly changing, always beyond full understanding. To describe him was to admit that he could never be fully described, and so the tales continued, each one adding another mask to his collection, another face to the shifting guardian of the woods. And as we follow these transformations, it becomes clear that the Leshy was never just a trickster or a monster. He was the explanation for the forest's shifting, unstable nature, the voice behind its sudden changes. To step into his realm was to step into a place where nothing could be trusted, not even your own senses. And it is within this uncertainty that his power truly lies, drawing us further into the ways he tested and tormented those who entered his domain. The stories of the Leshy were not born in books or written chronicles. They lived in the mouths of peasants, passed from one fire to the next, shaped by the lives of farmers, herdsmen, hunters, and wanderers who depended on the forest for survival and feared its dangers in equal measure. In villages where literacy was rare and daily life was ruled by weather, soil, and the threat of famine, folklore was not entertainment, but survival knowledge. To speak of the Leshy was to make sense of why a cow vanished into the trees, or why a neighbor failed to return from gathering firewood. He was not just a figure of imagination, but a presence woven into explanations of the everyday. In some of the earliest remembered tales, the Leshy appeared as a force of mischief. A shepherd leading his flock into the woods might hear laughter in the distance, the sound of children playing where no village stood. The sheep would scatter, pulled toward invisible calls, and the shepherd would spend hours chasing them. If he was lucky, he would find them gathered again near the edge of the forest, as if nothing had happened. If he was not, he might never recover them, the Leshy having claimed them as his own. For peasants who owned little more than a few animals, such losses were devastating, and so the Leshy became not just a story, but a warning. Never grow careless near the forest's edge, and never assume the woods are empty. Other tales tell of men and women returning from the forest confused and disoriented, unable to find their way, though they had walked the same path 100 times before. They would swear that something had shifted, that the trees had moved, that voices had called them in circles. Villagers would nod and say it was the Leshy, for everyone knew he delighted in turning travelers around until they collapsed from exhaustion. To prevent this, peasants carried bread or salt in their pockets, small offerings to leave if they sensed the Leshy's presence. The idea was not to defeat him, but to appease him, to give him something so he would lose interest and let you pass. One story from the Russian north speaks of a young woodcutter who ignored such customs. He laughed at the warnings, saying he had grown up among the trees and knew them better than any spirit. One morning he set off to cut timber and did not return. His friends searched for him, following his tracks, but they found only a circle of chopped stumps, as though he had worked all day in the same spot without moving. No body, no tools, no trace. The circle remained, and locals whispered that he had been taken by the Leshy, punished for his arrogance. For years afterward, the villagers avoided that patch of forest, certain it was claimed by the spirit. Another tale, softer in tone, tells of a lost girl who wandered too far from her village while picking berries. She cried as the woods grew darker, certain she would never find her way back. Then a tall figure appeared, moss in his beard and branches in his hair, his eyes gleaming green. He did not speak, but he pointed her toward a path, and when she followed it, she found herself at the village edge. The Leshy, they said, had taken pity on her because she was a child and no threat to his domain. But the villagers warned her that such mercy could not be counted on. The Leshy helped only when it pleased him, and his favor could turn to cruelty without reason. These stories reveal the duality at the heart of the Leshy's reputation. He was unpredictable, sometimes saving, sometimes destroying, always keeping humans uncertain. And in that uncertainty lay power. The peasants could never claim mastery over the forest. Their crops, their animals, their lives were always at its mercy. The Leshy embodied that truth, showing through his actions that survival required humility. Those who respected him and showed care might pass safely. Those who mocked or ignored him risked never returning. The oral tales often focused on small details, the kind that stuck in memory. People said the Leshy's laughter echoed like wind through the trees, hollow and sharp. They said his footsteps could shake the ground, but other times he moved so silently, even animals gave no warning. They said he could speak in any voice, from a child's whimper to a father's call. These details were repeated again and again until they became part of the shared knowledge of how to identify him. In this way, folklore acted almost like a survival guide disguised as a story. Some of the most vivid encounters came from hunters, men who ventured deep into the woods alone for days at a time. One hunter told of stalking a deer through the underbrush, following its tracks in fresh snow. The tracks grew larger, then stranger, until they no longer looked like hooves, but like human feet, and then they vanished entirely. As he stood in confusion, he heard laughter behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Frightened, he abandoned the hunt and returned to his village, certain he had nearly fallen victim to the Leshy's trickery. Another hunter spoke of a wolf that walked alongside him, silent and calm, not attacking, but not leaving either. Only later, when the animal turned and grinned with human teeth, did the hunter realize what he had been traveling with. These stories were not just entertainment in long winters, they were lived experiences passed through generations. To dismiss them would be to ignore the reality that many people vanished in the woods without explanation. The Leshy was how communities made sense of that loss, how they explained the dangers they could not control. He was the face given to accidents, to disappearances, to the merciless side of nature. But he was also the explanation for sudden strokes of good fortune, a hunter finding abundant game after leaving a piece of bread on a stump, a shepherd recovering his flock unharmed after whispering a prayer. To peasants, he was not abstract. He was as real as the forest that bordered their fields. One particularly old tale tells of a man who sought the Leshy out deliberately. His village had suffered a famine, and the hunters brought back nothing. Desperate, the man entered the forest alone, carrying bread, salt, and vodka as offerings. He laid them on a stump and called aloud, asking the Leshy for aid. The wind rose, the branches shook, and a towering figure appeared, its face hidden in shadow. The Leshy accepted the gifts and in return told the man where to find game. The man followed the instructions and returned with enough meat to feed his village. From then on, the people left offerings at that same spot every year, believing they had forged a pact with the forest spirit. Such stories blurred the line between superstition and ritual, showing how deeply the Leshy was tied to the cycles of survival. It was not uncommon for peasants to speak of entire families encountering him. A tale from central Russia describes a group of villagers traveling together through the forest when a sudden fog surrounded them. They heard voices calling from all directions, including the voices of their own companions. Panic spread, and they began to argue about which way to go. In the chaos, one man remembered the advice of his grandfather: "Turn your clothes inside out, curse the Leshy, and he will lose interest." The group did as he said, and the fog cleared, the voices silenced. They reached the village shaken but unharmed, swearing they had nearly been led to their deaths. These encounters shaped daily behavior. Children were warned never to answer if they heard their names called in the woods. Travelers were told to mark their paths carefully, to carry offerings, to show respect. The Leshy was not just a legend to frighten people into obedience, he was a framework for navigating the unpredictability of the wild. By embedding these rules in stories, communities passed on both fear and caution, ensuring that each generation understood the risks of venturing too far from home. When we collect these tales together, a portrait begins to form. The Leshy was not an abstract devil. He was immediate, local, tied to specific forests and paths. Each village had its own stories, its own warnings, its own places marked as his domain. To speak of the Leshy was to speak of a specific danger just beyond the fields, a danger that could not be ignored. And yet, through these same stories, he also became a source of identity. The forest was not faceless. It had a master, and by knowing his name, peasants could feel a measure of control, even if only through ritual and respect. As we move further into these accounts, the image of the Leshy grows clearer, but also stranger, for he was never just a voice in the trees or a trickster in disguise. He was also seen as a ruler, a herdsman of beasts, a keeper of the wild creatures themselves, and in the next part of our journey, we find that the Leshy's domain extended beyond deceiving travelers into the very heart of the animal kingdom. Among the many powers the Leshy was said to possess, none struck as deeply into the fears of those who entered the forest as his command over voice and sound. The trees were his walls, the canopy his roof, and within that vast, shifting hall, he could speak in any tone he wished. He could call a shepherd by name in the exact cadence of a brother's voice. He could cry like a child lost in the thickets. He could sing in a woman's tone so haunting it lured men from their paths without a second thought. For peasants who knew the forest well, these stories were not abstract. They were warnings carried in whispers. If you hear your name when no one is there, do not answer. If you hear laughter where the woods are silent, keep walking. For to respond was to step into the Leshy's game, and once you joined it, there was no certainty you would ever return. The mimicry was not only of human voices. Hunters swore they heard the calls of animals only to find themselves chasing nothing. A stag's bellow, clear and powerful, might echo through the trees, yet when followed would lead in circles until the hunter's legs failed. The Leshy's amusement lay not in killing outright, but in confusing, disorienting, reducing strong men to trembling wrecks by turning their own senses against them. He could make a man distrust his ears, then his eyes, then finally his very instincts, until all sense of direction and reason collapsed. This was not simple malice. It was a lesson the forest imposed, to remind humans they were never its masters, only guests whose arrogance could be stripped away in an instant. In some tales, the Leshy was said to walk alongside a traveller in the guise of a companion, talking in a voice so familiar it felt impossible to question. Hours might pass before some slip revealed the truth. Perhaps the man spoke without moving his lips. Perhaps his shadow pointed in the wrong direction. Perhaps he called the traveller by the wrong name, laughing when corrected. Once suspicion took hold, fear consumed the victim, because to realize you had been conversing with the Leshy meant the path home was already lost. The voice, so friendly and human, became hollow in memory, and the realization spread like ice. The forest had been speaking all along. Villagers described these encounters with grim seriousness. They were not told to amuse, but to caution. The voice in the trees was a force everyone acknowledged, and it explained why some disappeared without trace. No bandits had taken them, no wolves had attacked. They had followed a sound, certain it belonged to a friend or a child in need, and they had walked willingly into the heart of the forest where the Leshy waited. The power of his trickery was that it relied not on violence, but on trust, on the very human urge to respond to those we recognize. In this way, he turned human compassion into a weapon, proving once again that survival demanded suspicion and restraint when crossing into his domain. Yet not all stories painted the voice as purely destructive. In a handful of accounts, the Leshy's calls served as warnings. A shepherd who strayed too far from the village might hear his name and turn back, uneasy but safe. A woman gathering herbs could hear a sudden command to go home, and when she did, she later discovered wolves had been prowling nearby. These cases were rare but remembered, for they suggested the Leshy's games were not without purpose. He was a trickster, yes, but sometimes his tricks carried meaning. Like the forest itself, he could kill or shelter, depending on how he chose to play. The voice was often linked with echoes, a phenomenon already strange to those who had no knowledge of how sound carried. To hear your own words repeated back in a warped tone, stretched or mocked, was to hear the Leshy's laughter. Peasants explained echoes not as natural acoustics, but as the spirit's mockery. If you shouted in anger, the forest mocked you back. If you sang, it repeated your song in a twisted way. The Leshy was always listening, always answering, and the forest itself became his mouth. For those who entered alone, this sense of being overheard, of being observed, added to the dread. They were never unaccompanied, never unwatched. In one tale from Ukraine, a group of woodcutters heard the voice of a friend calling them deeper into the trees. The friend was standing among them, yet his voice echoed from ahead, urging them on. Confused and frightened, they refused to follow, and when they later investigated the area, they found a deep ravine hidden by undergrowth. The Leshy, they said, had tried to trick them into walking to their deaths. The story was retold as proof of his cruelty, but also of the wisdom of resisting voices that came from nowhere. It became common practice to carry iron tools or religious charms, to whistle or sing as one walked, breaking the silence and warding off the Leshy's attempts to lure them with sound. Another story told of a hunter who prided himself on his courage, swearing he feared no spirit. When he heard a woman crying in the woods, he went at once, eager to prove his bravery. The crying led him deeper, always a few steps ahead. Finally, he reached a clearing where the sound stopped. He searched and found nothing, but when he turned back, the path was gone. He wandered for days, circling endlessly, until his food was gone and his strength failed. When he was finally found by villagers searching for him, he was nearly dead. His hair turned white with fear. He never spoke of what he saw in that clearing, only muttered about the crying voice and the trees that seemed to laugh. For the rest of his life, he refused to enter the forest again. Such tales reinforced the lesson that courage alone was not enough against the Leshy. Intelligence, humility, and caution mattered more. To charge after every sound, to trust every call, was to surrender to him. The wise traveler knew that silence was deceptive and that voices in the woods were not to be trusted. This wisdom became ingrained in peasant life. Children were told not to stray when they heard laughter among the trees. Shepherds sang constantly so the Leshy's mimicry could be more easily detected. Hunters left offerings not just for success but for protection from his tricks. The voice in the trees was not just a story, it was an everyday reality that shaped behavior. The trickery extended beyond voices. The Leshy was said to twist paths so they looped endlessly, returning travelers to the same place no matter how far they walked. Men would mark trees with their knives, only to find the marks gone the next time they passed. They would lay branches to mark their way, only to see them scattered. The forest under the Leshy's hand was unstable, shifting like his form, and the disorientation it caused was part of his amusement. To be lost was to be in his grasp, and the voice calling from the trees was only the beginning of the trap. But while the mimicry was feared, it also made the Leshy a strangely intimate figure. He did not remain distant like a storm god striking from the sky. He whispered in your ear, spoke in the tone of your loved ones, walked beside you in disguise. He was not an abstract threat, but a personal one, reaching into the most trusted parts of human life and bending them. His mastery of trickery was not brute force, but subtle manipulation, a reminder that the wild did not need claws and teeth to destroy. It could undo you with nothing more than sound. Through these stories, the image of the Leshy becomes sharper. He was not simply a giant striding through the forest or a shapeshifter laughing at human confusion. He was also a presence woven into the very fabric of the woods, able to use its echoes, its silences, its whispers as weapons. To hear him was to be drawn into his domain, whether you wished it or not. And as his voice spread through the trees, carrying laughter and calls that bent reality, he revealed another of his roles, not just a trickster, but a keeper, a ruler of more than humans, a herdsman of the beasts themselves who moved under his command. For those who lived at the forest's edge, the Leshy was not only the voice that deceived them or the shapeshifter who unsettled their senses. He was also the master of the creatures that lived beneath the trees, the invisible herdsman whose domain extended over every bird, beast, and insect. Hunters, shepherds, and farmers alike spoke of him not simply as a trickster, but as the keeper of animals, the one who decided whether a man's snare caught a rabbit or whether his traps remained empty, whether a hunter's rifle struck true or misfired into silence. The Leshy's role as the herdsman of the wild was perhaps the most enduring image in peasant life, for it connected him not only to the mystery of the woods, but to the daily survival of the people who depended on its bounty. Cattle were a lifeline for peasants, their milk, meat, and hides sustaining entire households. Shepherds who drove their herds to graze near the edge of the forest were always at risk of losing them, and when animals disappeared without trace, the cause was laid at the Leshy's feet. He was said to take the form of a cow or a bull, blending into the herd, and then, when the moment came, leading the animals deeper into the trees. Sometimes he returned them after a day or two, as if reminding the shepherd of who truly owned them. Other times they were gone forever, absorbed into his invisible herds that roamed in hidden valleys of the forest. In this way, the Leshy reminded humans that domesticated animals might live with people, but their origin and true belonging was to the wilderness. Hunters, too, understood this power. They did not see themselves as free to take from the forest as they pleased. They believed the Leshy allowed or denied their success. A hunter who failed repeatedly might be said to have angered the Leshy, while one who brought home abundant game was said to be favored. This belief turned the hunt into a ritual, a negotiation with the unseen master of beasts. Offerings of bread, salt, or coins were sometimes left at stumps or crossroads, given not to any god in heaven, but to the herdsman of the forest, who decided whether deer, boar, or bear would appear before the hunter's eyes. Tales from across the Slavic lands describe the Leshy driving vast herds of animals through the woods, not just cattle, but deer, elk, and horses. Villagers told of hearing the thunder of hooves on the forest floor, yet when they looked, no animals were there. The noise was the Leshy's herd, invisible to human eyes, but as real as the ground beneath their feet. Sometimes these herds were glimpsed in flashes, dozens of deer running where none should have been, a white horse leading a train of wild stallions across a meadow before vanishing into shadow. These were not ordinary creatures, but his personal charges, wild and untouchable, symbols of his mastery over the animal kingdom. In one well-known story, a hunter encountered a magnificent stag unlike any he had ever seen, with antlers spreading wide as the branches of a tree. He raised his bow, but as he prepared to shoot, the stag turned its head, and the hunter saw human eyes gleaming in its sockets. The shock made him lower his weapon, and in that moment, the stag vanished. The villagers said he had met the Leshy in animal form, testing his respect for the forest's creatures. Had he fired, he might never have returned home. The tale carried a simple lesson. The beasts of the forest were not yours to take without permission. They belonged to the herdsman, and he decided which, if any, were yours to hunt. The Leshy's relationship with animals was not limited to control. In many tales, he was their protector, punishing those who hunted wastefully or killed for sport. A man who slew more animals than he needed might find himself haunted by the Leshy's laughter, his traps empty, his paths leading nowhere. Others spoke of the Leshy appearing in human form to chastise hunters directly, warning them that greed would bring misfortune. In this sense, he was not only a master, but a moral force, embodying the idea that the forest demanded balance. To take too much was to invite the wrath of its keeper. But the Leshy was also unpredictable, and his relationship with animals could be cruel. Stories tell of him scattering flocks, driving sheep into swamps or wolves into herds of cattle, destroying livelihoods overnight. In these accounts, he was not a fair guardian, but a capricious master, using animals as tools to torment humans. Yet even here, his role as herdsman remained clear. The beasts moved under his command, whether to feed or to punish, and humans were left helpless before his will. Shepherds developed rituals to protect their animals from his interference. Before leading flocks into pasture, they might trace protective signs with knives or sprinkle holy water at the edge of the woods. Some tied threads of red yarn around the necks of cattle, believing it would confuse the Leshy's gaze. Others left small offerings at stumps, hoping to buy his favor. These acts show how real his presence was in daily life. He was not a distant myth, but a constant concern, a being who could take or spare the animals on which families depended. The Leshy's control of animals extended even to predators. Wolves, feared by all, were said to be his dogs, unleashed when he wished to punish a village. Bears, too, were sometimes described as his companions, roaming where he walked. Hunters who killed such creatures without offering respect were thought to risk his vengeance. The idea that wolves or bears belonged to him reinforced the sense that the wild was not chaotic, but ordered under his unseen hand. To encounter a predator was not simply misfortune, it was a sign of the herdsman's will. One fascinating aspect of his role was the belief that he could trade animals with humans. Stories tell of hunters or shepherds bargaining with him, offering gifts in exchange for safe passage or the return of lost cattle. Sometimes these bargains were honored, sometimes not, but the very existence of such tales shows that people saw him as a negotiator, a figure who could be petitioned and bargained with. This made him different from mindless beasts or even other spirits. He was a conscious ruler, one who could make deals, set terms, and enforce them. The image of the Leshy as herdsman also connected him to ancient pre-Christian beliefs about gods of animals and the wild. In many traditions, a divine or semi-divine figure was thought to guard the creatures of the forest, ensuring their cycles of life and death remained balanced. The Leshy inherited this role in Slavic imagination, reduced perhaps from god to spirit, but still holding the authority of a master over beasts. He was the one who kept the wilderness alive, who made sure animals multiplied, migrated, and filled the woods. To disrespect him was to risk breaking that cycle, with consequences for all. The peasants who told these stories did not need philosophy to understand what the Leshy represented. For them, he was the reason some hunters thrived while others starved, the reason herds returned safely or vanished, the reason wolves prowled near the village one year and not the next. His presence explained the unpredictability of animals, giving their behavior meaning in human terms. He was the invisible herdsman, unseen but always felt, the one who walked with the beasts and decided their fate. As the tales deepened, the Leshy's connection to animals revealed even more about his nature. He was not just a trickster of men, but a ruler in his own right, with dominion over the living things of the forest. This role made him a figure of awe and terror, but also one of strange respect, for in his hand lay the balance between survival and ruin. And as the stories spread, they showed that his mastery was not only over beasts, but over humans as well, for just as he herded animals, he could herd men and women too, leading them in circles with his voice, scattering them with his laughter, and pulling them toward his unseen pastures hidden deep within the woods. Hunters walked closest to the Leshy's shadow. Of all the peasants, it was they who ventured furthest into his domain, who relied on the bounty of the wild for their survival. and who risked most when they forgot that the forest was not theirs to command. To hunt was to step into negotiation with the Leshy, whether spoken or unspoken. Every arrow that struck true, every rifle that found its mark, was believed to carry the spirit's approval. Every failed attempt, every empty-handed return, was taken as a sign of his disfavor. The Leshy was the invisible judge of the hunt, deciding whether man would feast or starve, and the relationship between him and hunters was always one of uneasy bargains and inevitable betrayals. From childhood, hunters were taught that respect for the forest's master was not optional. Before leaving for a hunt, men might bow at the tree line, whispering a prayer or leaving a crust of bread on a stump. Some sprinkled salt in the grass or poured a few drops of vodka into the soil. These were not grand sacrifices, but small gestures of humility, acknowledgements that the animals of the woods were not simply there for the taking. They belonged to the herdsman, and one hunted only with his consent. Those who ignored this risked more than failure. They risked becoming the prey themselves. Stories told of hunters who scoffed at such customs, boasting that their skill alone guaranteed success. One man, it was said, went into the forest with no offering, mocking those who wasted food on invisible spirits. He found tracks easily enough, but each time he raised his weapon, his hands trembled, his aim failed, and his target slipped away. Day after day, the same pattern repeated, until the hunter returned exhausted and empty-handed. Worse still, when he tried to leave the forest, he found the paths twisted, the landmarks unfamiliar. He wandered in circles, hearing laughter echo through the trees, until finally he collapsed. His body was found days later, face down in the moss. Villagers nodded and said the Leshy had taken his due, punishing arrogance with death. Yet arrogance was not the only danger. Even hunters who showed respect sometimes found themselves tricked. The Leshy was not a god bound by fairness, but a spirit of the wild, unpredictable and changeable. He might accept an offering and then lead the hunter astray anyway, guiding him to barren places where no game lived. He might appear in the form of an animal, luring the hunter into deeper woods where he would lose his way. These betrayals were part of his nature, for to trust him fully was to forget that he was trickster as much as guardian. His bargains were never guarantees, they were invitations to risk. At the same time, there are countless stories of hunters who gained extraordinary success after making offerings or speaking respectfully to the Leshy. One tale tells of a man who left bread and salt on a stump, bowing 3 times before entering the woods. That day, he encountered more game than he could carry, and he returned home with his sled overflowing. For years afterward, he kept the ritual, and his hunts never failed. Another story speaks of a hunter who, after days of misfortune, prayed directly to the Leshy, promising a portion of his catch in exchange for help. The next morning, he found a stag waiting near his camp. True to his word, he left the animal's heart and liver at the stump where he had prayed. From then on, he was said to live in quiet prosperity, his relationship with the Leshy one of mutual exchange. But the most dangerous tales were those of hunters who broke their bargains. To promise the Leshy a share and then keep it was to invite disaster. In one grim story, a man offered the first animal he killed if the Leshy would lead him to game. That day he shot a great boar larger than any he had seen before. Proud and greedy, he took the meat home and gave nothing. The next time he hunted, he found nothing for days. Then he heard the cries of animals all around him, but each time he moved toward them, the sounds shifted, leading him deeper into the forest. The laughter of the Leshy followed him, louder each night, until the hunter's mind broke. He returned home empty, raving about voices and shadows, and never hunted again. The villagers said the Leshy had claimed his sanity as payment for the broken bargain. There were also darker accounts in which betrayal ended not with madness, but with death. Hunters who failed to keep promises were sometimes found lifeless in the forest, their bodies unmarked but their faces twisted in expressions of terror. These deaths were never explained as natural. They were the Leshy's justice, proof that betrayal of him carried consequences beyond human judgment. In such stories, the Leshy resembled a lord exacting tribute, ruthless in enforcing loyalty. Hunters did not only make bargains for game, some sought the Leshy's aid in learning secret knowledge. It was said he knew the herbs of the forest, the calls of animals, the tracks and trails hidden from human eyes. A hunter who encountered him and spoke respectfully might be granted this wisdom. But as always, the gift was double-edged. Knowledge from the Leshy carried danger, for it bound the hunter closer to him, making the man more dependent on his favor. Those who learned too much were said to risk becoming his servants, trapped forever in his domain. In certain regions, tales described the Leshy demanding service in exchange for success. A hunter might be required to spend nights in the forest, watching over the spirit's herds. If he succeeded, he would be rewarded with endless game. If he failed, he would be punished, sometimes devoured, sometimes transformed into a wolf or a wandering phantom. These stories reveal the deeper truth of his bargains. They were never simple. The Leshy was not a merchant making fair trades. He was a master testing the worth of those who entered his world, rewarding some, destroying others, and keeping the balance always in his hands. Hunters often spoke of being followed by uncanny animals, wolves that did not attack, stags that circled them without fear, birds that called from branches in strange patterns. These were said to be messengers of the Leshy, testing the hunter's patience, measuring his respect. To shoot such creatures was dangerous. They might not be animals at all, but the Leshy himself in disguise. A hunter who killed one might find himself cursed, his luck gone forever. Thus, restraint became as important as skill. The hunter had to know when to act and when to hold back, for not every beast in the woods was meant for human arrows. There are even tales of hunters who became bound to the Leshy through blood. If a man wounded an animal that escaped into the forest, the Leshy might claim it as his own. To follow too far was to trespass, and some hunters who pushed on were said to vanish, swallowed by the spirit's domain. In these accounts the bargain was unspoken but absolute. What entered the Leshy's forest belonged to him, and to challenge this was to challenge his rule. The theme of betrayal also worked in reverse. The Leshy himself was not above breaking his word. Hunters who thought they had made a fair deal often found themselves deceived, given false directions, or led into swamps and thickets. Yet even here, peasants explained this not as malice, but as a reminder. The Leshy was not human. He did not honor promises as men did. He was the wild itself, and his bargains reflected its unpredictability. To deal with him was always to risk betrayal, for the forest could never be fully tamed or trusted. And so, the relationship between hunters and the Leshy was one of constant tension. It was a dance of gifts and punishments, of respect and mockery, of bargains that might save a family or ruin a life. Every trip into the forest carried this risk, and every success or failure was interpreted through his will. He was the unseen companion of every hunt, the shadow behind every tree, the master who decided whether man or beast would fall that day. From these stories, it becomes clear that the Leshy was more than a trickster voice or a shapeshifter of forms. He was a figure of power, one who held the lives of men and animals in his grasp. To hunters, he was rival, ally, and judge all at once, impossible to predict, impossible to avoid. And as his bargains shaped the fate of those who hunted, so too did his presence shape the boundaries of the forest itself. For where he dwelled, paths twisted and thresholds formed, marking the edges of a domain that was never truly human. The Leshy was never confined to a single shape, and neither was he confined to a single place. He did not live in houses or huts like other spirits of folklore. He had no fixed dwelling, no hearth or corner to be claimed. Instead, His presence was strongest in the places that were neither one thing nor another, thresholds where human order blurred into wilderness and where certainty dissolved into confusion. For villagers, these boundaries carried great weight. A field could be mapped, a path could be walked, but the edges where the known touched the unknown were always suspect. It was in these places, they said, that the Leshy waited. Crossroads were among the most dangerous of these sites. To stand where two paths met was to stand in uncertainty, not fully committed to any direction. Stories told that the Leshy lingered at such places, whispering in voices that urged travelers to take one path over another. A man who chose wrongly might find himself walking in circles for hours, always returning to the same fork. Some said the Leshy enjoyed such games more than any other, for he did not need to show himself. Confusion alone was enough to mark his triumph. Villagers avoided crossroads after dark, and if they had to pass, they made the sign of the cross or left a small offering, hoping to distract the spirit long enough to pass unseen. The edges of fields and forests were another threshold where the Leshy's presence was felt most strongly. Fields represented human effort, tilled soil, and order. The forest beyond represented wildness, danger, and powers outside human control. The line between the two was not just a physical border, but a symbolic one, and to cross it was to enter his domain. Shepherds leading cattle to graze near this line were most vulnerable, for the Leshy was said to lurk there watching. He needed only a moment of carelessness to slip among the animals, leading them astray. Even children understood this, warned never to wander near the tree line without protection, for the Leshy claimed all who crossed without permission. Boundaries between villages also carried his influence. Paths that linked one settlement to another often cut through dense woods, and travelers were always on guard. To leave the safety of one village and walk into the in-between space of forest road was to step into his domain. Villagers explained disappearances this way. A man left one village and never arrived at the other, not because of bandits or wolves, but because the Leshy had claimed him in the uncertain middle ground. Stories like these gave weight to the dangers of travel and reminded people that the forest was not empty space but a realm with its own ruler. Waterways too played their part, rivers that wound through the trees, marshes that blurred land and water, ponds hidden beneath branches. These were places where the Leshy was said to appear. Just as he commanded animals, he was thought to influence the movements of fish and the safety of crossings. Travelers spoke of hearing his voice near fords, calling them into deeper currents. Shepherds told of cattle led into swamps where they drowned, claimed by the spirit who watched from the trees. Like crossroads, these watery boundaries were liminal, places where categories broke down, and the Leshy thrived wherever certainty collapsed. It is not surprising that stories so often placed him at thresholds. In folklore across many cultures, spirits inhabit the in-between. They are not fully of one world or another, and they claim the spaces that mirror their own nature. The Leshy, with his shifting forms and unstable loyalties, was the perfect inhabitant of such places. He was not god or man, not demon or animal, but something between all of them. And so he lived where one thing gave way to another, where the clear lines of human life dissolved into the ambiguity of the wild. This made his presence especially frightening at night. Darkness was itself a boundary, the shift from light to shadow, and villagers said the Leshy moved most freely after sunset. Crossroads became more treacherous, tree lines more threatening, paths more uncertain. A traveller caught between villages after dusk risked not only wolves or bandits, but the laughter of the Leshy, who could twist directions until the night swallowed the wanderer whole. The fear of being caught out after dark was so strong that many villages enforced communal warnings, calling people back before sunset. It was not only to keep children safe from animals, it was to keep them from hearing the voice in the trees that marked the Leshy's nearness. But boundaries were not only physical, they were also seasonal. The transitions between winter and spring, or summer and autumn, were thought to be times when the Leshy's power surged. At these thresholds of the year, when life turned toward growth or death, he was most active. Farmers marked these times with rituals, leaving offerings at the forest edge to appease him. Failure to do so risked poor hunts or the loss of livestock. The belief in his seasonal strength reflected the same principle. He was strongest where things shifted, where certainty gave way to change. Some tales even describe people deliberately seeking him at boundaries, especially at crossroads. Hunters desperate for luck or herdsmen desperate for protection of their cattle might go at midnight to a crossroads with offerings of bread, salt, or alcohol. There, they would call his name and wait. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times a great wind would rise, or a figure would appear tall and shadowed to bargain. These encounters were dangerous, for once the Leshy was called, he could not be dismissed easily. If the hunter failed to keep his promises, the spirit would hound him relentlessly. Villagers warned against such practices, saying that bargains at crossroads rarely ended well. Yet desperation drove men to risk them, for survival often required boldness, even if it meant dealing with the master of the wild. In certain regions, the Leshy was also associated with sacred groves or old trees that marked invisible borders. These were places avoided by villagers, not because they were useless, but because they were thought to be claimed. A single great oak in the forest, ancient and massive, was often treated as his seat of power. To cut such a tree was unthinkable, for it invited his wrath. These natural boundaries within the forest were respected as lines between safe and forbidden, known and unknown. The Leshy's ownership was not marked by fences or signs, but by the stories that kept people away. What is striking is how consistent these themes are across the tales. Wherever humans faced uncertainty, at crossroads, edges, thresholds, or transitions, the Leshy was said to dwell. He was the embodiment of uncertainty itself, and to meet him was to step into ambiguity where no rules held firm. His domain was not a fixed place, but a pattern, a presence tied to every boundary where safety and danger touched. This made him impossible to escape entirely. Even if one avoided the deep forest, even if one stayed close to fields, the Leshy was there at the edge, watching. Even if one traveled carefully along known paths, the moment a crossroads appeared, the risk returned. He could not be walled off or banished, for he lived in the very nature of transition, and so villagers lived with him, respecting the thresholds, fearing the crossings, acknowledging that beyond every clear line lay a shadow that belonged to him, and within those shadows his games grew stranger still. For the Leshy was not content only to mislead travelers or scatter cattle. He could also step into the lives of men directly, appearing not only in strange forms, but as uncanny doubles of those they knew, walking beside them in disguise. This power to become a doppelganger was perhaps his most unsettling trick of all, and it carried his role as master of deception to its darkest extreme. The Leshy's tricks with voice and shadow were terrifying enough, but what unsettled villagers most were the stories of him appearing not only as animals or giants, but as people, sometimes strangers, sometimes exact replicas of those they loved. It was said that he could walk among men wearing a human face so convincingly that only the smallest, most uncanny detail betrayed him. This power made him the most dangerous kind of deceiver, for he did not need to scare or chase. He could walk at your side, speak in familiar tones, and lead you step by step into ruin before you realized who you were truly following. Peasant tales are full of warnings about these uncanny doubles. A man might set off into the forest with a companion, only to discover along the way that his friend's buttons were sewn backward, or his shadow pointed in the wrong direction, or his footprints in the snow led not forward but back. The realization would chill him to the bone, because by then the forest around them had already changed, the path home erased. To notice the detail was to understand too late that he had not been walking with his friend at all, but with the Leshy in disguise. Some stories are even crueler. In one, a group of hunters traveled together, but as dusk fell, they heard another voice calling from ahead. It sounded exactly like one of their own, though that man stood beside them. Confused, they argued, unsure which was the real companion. The Leshy thrived on this doubt, driving wedges of mistrust between men who needed each other most. Hunters returned from such experiences shaken, whispering that no bond of brotherhood could be trusted in the Leshy's forest. He could split men apart without lifting a weapon, turning trust into fear with nothing more than a perfect imitation. Other tales focus on lone travelers. A woman gathering firewood might meet her husband in the trees, greeting her warmly and offering to help carry the bundle. Grateful, she followed him, only to notice after some distance that his footsteps were reversed, pointing toward her instead of away. Horror struck as she realized she had been walking not with her husband, but with the Leshy himself, leading her deeper into the woods. Such stories carried heavy warnings. If you meet someone in the forest unexpectedly, always look twice. Check their eyes, their shadow, their footprints. A familiar face could be your death. The uncanny twin was not only a trick to lure, it was also a weapon of confusion, for the Leshy could appear as you yourself. Men spoke of encountering their own likeness in the forest, standing silently among the trees. To see one's double was a terrifying omen, often said to foretell death or madness. In some accounts, the doppelganger moved independently, leading the man astray as if mocking him. In others, it followed him home, sitting silently in the corner of his hut until vanishing. Such tales blurred the line between folklore and nightmare, but they reinforced the same point. The Leshy was not only the forest's ruler, he was its mirror, reflecting men back at themselves in ways that unsettled and destroyed. What gave these stories their power was how they turned everyday bonds and certainties into vulnerabilities. A voice you trust, a face you love, even your own reflection. None of these were safe in the Leshy's world. His role as uncanny twin revealed his deeper nature. He was not simply about mischief or punishment. He was about erasing certainty itself. In a world where survival depended on trust in companions, in family, in one's own senses, the Leshy undermined that trust completely. To enter his forest was to step into a place where nothing could be relied upon, not even your own identity. Some villagers told of clever ways to outwit the Leshy when he appeared as a double. One common trick was to curse or insult the figure. The Leshy, unable to endure blasphemy, would vanish at once, leaving the traveler shaken but safe. Others recommended turning clothing inside out or switching shoes to the opposite feet, confusing the spirit with his own methods. In some regions, it was said that crossing oneself while looking directly at the double would force the Leshy to reveal his true form, often a shadowy giant or a beast with burning eyes. But these defenses were never certain, and many tales ended with the traveler lost forever. The idea of the doppelganger also explained why people vanished so frequently. In a time before maps or compasses were common, to become lost in the forest was tragically easy. Families would search, sometimes finding bodies, sometimes not. To make sense of such disappearances, villagers said the Leshy had lured the victim by appearing as a familiar face. This explanation carried more weight than the idea of simple misfortune, for it gave meaning to the loss. The forest had claimed the person through its master's tricks, and nothing could be done. There are rare accounts of the Leshy using this power not to destroy, but to guide. In one tale, a boy was lost in the woods for 2 days, and when he was finally found, he claimed his older brother had been with him the whole time, leading him back toward the village. But the brother had never left home. The villagers whispered that the Leshy had taken the boy's brother's form to protect him, perhaps out of pity. Such stories, though rare, reveal the complexity of his role. He was not bound to cruelty alone. His games could save as well as destroy, though never in ways men could predict. The presence of the uncanny twin in so many tales shows just how deeply the Leshy touched the psychology of those who feared him. He was not distant or abstract. He stepped into the most intimate spaces of trust and identity, twisting them. His voice could sound like your mother's call. His face could look like your brother's. He could stand before you wearing your own form, your own smile. The terror was not only of being lost, but of realizing that everything familiar could betray you. And in this way, the Leshy's role as doppelganger tied directly to his larger function as ruler of the thresholds. At crossroads, in liminal places, in spaces between light and dark, he appeared as something that blurred boundaries, human and inhuman, familiar and alien, self and other. His power was to destabilize, to take what people trusted most and render it uncertain. That was the essence of the forest's danger, and he was its perfect embodiment. As we follow these tales, we begin to see the Leshy not just as a solitary figure, but as one with ties and kin of his own. For some stories claimed he was not alone in the woods, that he had a wife and children, a family hidden among the shadows, who sometimes appeared to humans and sometimes lured them deeper still. For all his shifting forms and tricks, many tales insisted the Leshy was not alone in the forest. Just as peasants lived in families, with wives, husbands and children shaping the rhythm of their lives, so too was the Leshy imagined as part of a strange household of his own. This gave him not only greater depth but greater menace, for a solitary spirit might be unpredictable, but a spirit with kin became a whole clan, a shadowy counterpart to the villages that stood at the edge of the trees. In these stories, the Leshy's wife and children appeared, sometimes helping, sometimes harming, and always reinforcing the sense that the wilderness was not empty, but alive with powers that mirrored and mocked the human world. The Leshy's wife was known in some regions as the Leshachika, in others simply as the forest woman. She was said to share her husband's shifting nature, able to appear in many forms. Sometimes she looked like a beautiful woman dressed in green, her hair long and tangled with leaves, her eyes bright as the forest after rain. At other times she was hideous, with bark for skin and claws instead of fingers, her laughter echoing like splintering wood. Villagers said she was just as dangerous as her husband, if not more so, for she combined his tricks with a woman's guile, luring men to their doom not only with voices and doubles, but with beauty and seduction. Some tales warned hunters and travelers against following strange women they met in the woods, for many claimed these were not human at all, but the Leshy's wife. A man who followed her might vanish, never to return, or reappear days later disoriented, pale, and unable to speak of what had happened. Others said that if she took a liking to someone, she could keep them in her household beneath the trees, turning them into servants or companions. In these stories, the Leshachika was less a wife in the human sense and more a queen of the forest, a counterpart to her husband who ruled beside him and extended his influence into new forms of trickery. The children of the Leshy also appeared in folklore, though less frequently. They were described as wild, unruly beings who played cruel games with human children, luring them into the forest to become lost. Some said they were indistinguishable from human children until it was too late. A peasant might see a boy or girl playing at the edge of the trees, dressed in ordinary clothes, laughing and calling. But once followed, the child would lead their playmate into thickets and bogs, vanishing at the last moment while the human child cried in terror. These were the Leshy's offspring, carrying on their father's work with youthful mischief. Parents warned their children never to follow strange playmates near the woods, for fear they were not human at all, but part of the forest's hidden family. The presence of a family gave the Leshy's world a strange sense of order. He was not merely a solitary ruler of beasts and voices. He had a wife, children, and a household, suggesting that the forest itself had a kind of domestic life, parallel to the villages that bordered it. Just as peasants worked their fields together as families, so too did the spirits of the forest live in households, reminding humans that they were not as different from the wild as they might think. The Leshy's family was a distorted mirror of their own, both familiar and unsettling. Yet these relationships were far from peaceful. Stories often described quarrels between the Leshy and his wife, their arguments shaking the trees or stirring sudden winds. Thunderstorms, villagers said, were caused by their fights. Others believed that when hunters encountered strange storms in the forest, it was a sign the Leshy's household was in turmoil. The idea that spirits argued and fought like humans gave them a strange humanity, while also explaining the violence of nature itself. There are also tales in which the Leshy's wife was more merciful than her husband. In some accounts, she pitied lost children and guided them back to their villages. Her maternal side, though rarely emphasized, softened her role and created an image of balance within the household. If the Leshy punished arrogance, his wife sometimes rewarded innocence. But this was never guaranteed, and she could just as easily lead a child astray. Like her husband, she embodied unpredictability. Her moods, like the weather, shifted without warning. In certain Slavic regions, people even spoke of multiple Leshys, a whole race of forest beings living in families and clans. Each grove or part of the forest might have its own guardian, its own Leshy with a wife and children, all under the rule of a greater lord of the forest. This view turned the wilderness into a kind of kingdom, peopled not by animals alone, but by countless spirits bound in families, each mirroring human society, but with power far beyond it. For peasants who lived surrounded by endless woods, this image made sense. The forest was vast, more than one spirit could rule. To imagine it filled with families of Leshys gave scale to its mystery and reinforced the idea that every tree, every thicket was watched. The children of the Leshy were also sometimes blamed for minor mischief. If tools went missing at the forest edge, if animals were spooked without cause, if children returned home claiming they had been led astray by playmates no one else saw, these things were attributed to the forest children. Unlike their father, they did not always mean harm. Sometimes they simply caused trouble, laughing and scattering belongings, testing the patience of peasants. Yet their very existence reinforced the point. The forest was alive with its own households, its own children running wild, just as human children did in the village lanes. This theme of family, so persistent in folklore, also served as a reminder that the Leshy was not completely outside human imagination. He was monstrous, yes, but also shaped by human ideas of kinship. To imagine him with a wife and children was to humanize him in a way, to make him more comprehensible. Even in his otherness, peasants tried to frame him within the structures they knew. Just as their own lives were defined by marriage and offspring, so too was his. The difference was that his family lived not in wooden huts but in shadows, their voices echoing through trees, their quarrels stirring storms. This humanization did not lessen the fear. In fact, it deepened it. For to think of the Leshy as a family man was to imagine him not as a lone danger, but as part of a network, with bonds and loyalties that made him harder to resist. A solitary spirit might be outwitted, but a family of spirits working together could surround a village with their influence. To speak of the Leshy's wife and children was to admit that the forest was not the domain of one, but of many, and that its power was not easily broken. Some even told tales of intermarriage between humans and the Leshy's family. A man who vanished in the forest might be said to have been taken as a husband for the Leshy's daughter. A woman who disappeared might be whispered to have become his wife. In these accounts, humans were absorbed into the forest household, never to return. Whether these stories were meant to explain disappearances or to warn against wandering too far, they reinforced the idea that the Leshy's family was both real and near, capable of reaching into the human world and claiming people for their own. And so, Through these tales, the Leshy's world expanded beyond the solitary trickster or shapeshifter. He became the head of a family, a ruler not only of animals but of kin. His wife and children mirrored human households in distorted form, their presence reminding villagers that the forest was not empty wilderness, but a place filled with beings who lived, quarreled, and schemed just beyond the tree line. As we move further, this humanization of the Leshy collides with a larger force, for when Christianity spread through the Slavic lands, it did not tolerate such spirits as ambiguous neighbors. The Leshy and his family were recast, stripped of their complexity, and condemned as demons. In this new order, the forest herdsman and his household became figures of exile, their domain reinterpreted through the lens of faith, and their ambiguous power turned toward the shadowed role of evil. For centuries, the Leshy lived in the stories of peasants as something more complicated than good or evil. He was dangerous, yes, but also necessary, a master of animals who punished greed and rewarded respect. His family made him more human, his shifting form made him more mysterious, and his bargains with hunters made him a figure who could not be ignored. But when Christianity spread through the Slavic lands, bringing with it a new order of saints, demons, and angels, the old spirits had to be recast. The church did not leave room for ambiguous forces who demanded offerings in the forest. The Leshy, once a spirit who ruled the wilderness, was rewritten as a devil, his tricks no longer lessons in humility but temptations from the enemy of Christ. This shift was not immediate. For a long time, peasants continued to believe in the Leshy as they always had, whispering about him even while attending church. But priests condemned such talk, calling it superstition, heresy, even idolatry. To leave bread or salt at the forest's edge was no longer seen as a respectful gesture, but as an offering to demons. The forest spirit who once embodied the balance between man and nature became, in sermons and religious writings, a minion of hell. His laughter was no longer the sound of the woods' mocking arrogance, but the mockery of Satan himself. Stories that once showed the Leshy as a teacher or protector were retold with darker tones. If he guided a child home, it was no longer out of pity, but as a trick to earn trust for greater harm later. If he granted a hunter success, it was painted as a devil's bargain, the price to be paid with the man's soul. Every kindness became a deception, every neutrality a mask for evil. This reframing stripped away the complexity of his character and flattened him into a single image, the forest demon, an agent of chaos opposed to Christian order. The church had reason to fear him. The Leshy was tied to rituals and beliefs that predated Christianity, and he embodied a worldview in which humans were not masters, but participants in a larger balance. Christianity taught dominion, the idea that man was placed above animals and nature by divine right. The Leshy, with his power over beasts and his demands for respect, contradicted this. He reminded peasants that they depended on the forest's gifts and that arrogance led to ruin. Such lessons clashed with the church's teaching that man ruled by God's grace, and so the Leshy had to be recast as an enemy. This demonization also reflected the church's broader strategy of replacing old gods and spirits with Christian figures. Perun, the thunder god, became associated with Saint Elijah. Veles, the god of cattle and the underworld, was cast as the devil himself. The Leshy, less prominent but deeply woven into daily life, fell into the same category. He was not granted a saintly counterpart, but was simply absorbed into the general image of the demonic. Where peasants had once spoken of him as the herdsman of the forest, priests warned them that he was a tempter, luring souls into sin and away from the true faith. Despite this, the old beliefs never fully vanished. In many villages, people lived with a double vision. By day, they prayed in church and spoke of angels and saints. By night, they whispered of the Leshy, warning children not to follow voices in the woods. The stories persisted because they spoke to realities the church could not erase. The forest was still dangerous, animals still vanished, hunters still lost their way. To explain these things only with devils and sin felt too distant, too moralized. The Leshy remained a closer, more immediate explanation, even if people now described him in darker terms. This blending of beliefs created fascinating contradictions. Some peasants crossed themselves before entering the forest, both to call on Christ and to protect against the Leshy. Others offered bread at stumps while muttering prayers, unsure whether they were honoring a saint or appeasing a demon. The Leshy lingered in this space between the old faith and the new, reshaped but not erased, condemned but still alive in the minds of those who walked the forest's edge. In this period, his image grew harsher. He was described more often as a deceiver bent on destruction, less as a teacher or guardian. His family too took on darker tones. The Lesha Chica, once a seductive or pitying figure, became a witch consort, luring men to sin. His children, once mischievous forest playmates, became demons in child's clothing, designed to corrupt the innocent. The whole household of the Leshy was darkened under Christianity's shadow, their ambiguity erased in favor of a single interpretation. All were enemies of God. What is striking, though, is how stubbornly the old elements remained. Even as the Leshy became a demon, peasants continued to describe him as master of animals, guardian of the forest, trickster of the crossroads. These qualities were too deeply rooted to be discarded. The church could condemn him, but the peasants still lived in the same world of forests, herds, and hunts that gave rise to him. And so, the Leshy endured in dual form. In sermons, a devil. In stories, still the shifting herdsman of the woods. This duality even shaped how people defended themselves against him. Crosses and prayers to Christ were common, but so too were the old practices of turning clothing inside out, carrying iron, or leaving offerings. Villagers did not see these as contradictions. They lived in a world where both systems overlapped and survival required using every tool available. The Leshy's transformation into a demon was powerful in words, but in practice he remained what he had always been, the forest itself, unpredictable and alive. The Christianization of the Leshy also reveals something about how people thought of demons. Unlike the abstract devils of theology, the Leshy was local, tied to specific groves and forests. He was not an idea, but a presence. This made him harder to erase because he was part of lived experience. A priest could preach against him, but the forest still loomed beyond the fields, and people still vanished within it. The Leshy filled that space with meaning, and no sermon could take it away. In this way, the Leshy became a figure of exile. He was pushed out of the realm of acceptable belief, condemned to the shadows, yet he never left. He remained in the minds of those who worked the land, haunting their stories and shaping their behavior. Christianity turned him into an enemy, but in doing so, it preserved him, for to denounce him was to acknowledge his persistence. And as the centuries passed, this tension between old and new gave rise to even stranger stories. For the Leshy was not only recast as a demon, but also drawn into the great cosmic conflicts of the Slavic imagination, set against figures like Perun, the thunder god, whose Christian counterpart became Elijah. In these tales, the Leshy's role expanded from local trickster to a force entangled in battles of cosmic scale, his exile not just from villages, but from heaven itself. When Christianity recast the Leshy as a demon, the old memories of gods did not vanish. They lingered beneath the surface, reshaped, adapted, but still alive in the imagination of the people. Among the figures who continued to cast a long shadow was Perun, the thunder god, wielder of lightning, defender of order, who clashed eternally with the forces of chaos represented by serpents, dragons, and spirits of the underworld. Over time, the Leshy became drawn into this cosmic duel, not always as a primary adversary, but as one of the wild powers who stood opposed to Perun's order. In this way, the forest trickster was elevated into a mythic role, embodying not only the local dangers of the woods, but the universal tension between wilderness and civilization, chaos and control, storm and stillness. Perun, in the old Slavic pantheon, was more than a stormbringer. He was the principle of authority, of law, of the structured cosmos. His thunderbolts cut through disorder, striking down dragons and serpentine beings who represented the watery chaos below. The Leshy, as master of forests, stood somewhere between these worlds. He was not a god of the heavens, nor was he a creature of the underworld. He belonged to the middle realm, the earth itself, where men built villages and forests grew in endless expanses. This made him dangerous, for he straddled boundaries. He was neither wholly against order nor fully on its side, sir. He served no master but his own, and so when his paths crossed with Perun's, the clash carried symbolic weight. One line of folklore presents the Leshy as a rebellious servant, once part of Perun's retinue but cast out for disobedience. In these tales, thunder is said to be Perun's way of chasing down his old servant, striking trees to drive him deeper into the forest. When lightning splits an oak, villagers said it was because the Leshy had hidden there, and Perun had flushed him out. Such stories reframed natural events in mythic terms, making storms not abstract weather, but battles fought over human heads, with the Leshy scrambling from tree to tree to escape his old master's wrath. In other accounts, the Leshy was allied with Veles, the god of cattle, wealth, and the underworld, who was Perun's eternal rival. Veles was often imagined as a serpent or dragon, a figure of chaos who stole Perun's cattle or hid in rivers, pursued relentlessly by thunderbolts. By linking the Leshy with Veles, peasants folded him into this mythic opposition. As keeper of animals and herds, the Leshy fit easily into Veles's sphere, becoming one of his wild allies. The forests, then, were not just local dangers but extensions of the greater cosmic struggle. To step into the woods was to step into a battlefield between order and chaos, lightning and shadow, Perun and the Leshy's kin. This cosmic framing added a new dimension to the Leshy's reputation. No longer just a trickster who misled travelers, he became a figure associated with the forces that opposed divine authority. Every storm was a reminder of the ongoing duel, with thunder interpreted as Perun's weapons and the swaying trees as the Leshy's defiance. The forest itself, bending and breaking under the storm, became the arena of their clash. Villagers, huddled in huts while lightning struck outside, would whisper that the Leshy was being chased, his laughter silenced by Perun's roar, his tricks burned away by holy fire. Yet even here, the ambiguity of the Leshy persisted. For while Perun was honored as a god of order, he was distant, lofty, concerned with battles that spanned heavens and underworlds. The Leshy remained closer, tied to the lives of peasants, their animals, their fields. In this way, he embodied the immediacy of the forest more than the abstract justice of thunder. People feared Perun's bolts, but they lived with the Leshy every day. The cosmic duel gave him grandeur, but it did not erase his intimacy. He remained the figure who could lead you astray with a voice or herd your cattle into a swamp, even as he was imagined fleeing lightning across the sky. What emerges from these stories is not a single clear myth, but a layering of traditions. The old pantheon placed Perun at the center of order, battling serpents and underworld beings. Later, folklore drew the Leshy into this structure, aligning him with Veles or casting him as a rebellious spirit hunted by thunder. Christianity then overlaid this with its own framework, turning Perun into Elijah, whose fiery chariot brought storms, and turning the Leshy into a demon chased by the saint's wrath. The peasants who told these tales were not concerned with consistency. They sought meaning in events, the storm, the lightning, the shattered tree, and they found it in the idea that the Leshy was being punished, hunted, or driven deeper into exile. Even so, there were tales that resisted this cosmic reduction. Some said that when thunder rolled, it was the Leshy himself making noise, stomping through the forest in anger, his voice booming across valleys. In this interpretation, he was not the hunted, but the hunter, the storm-bringer in his own right. Trees split, not because he fled Perun, but because his strength could not be contained. These accounts remind us again of his ambiguity. He could be victim or aggressor, ally or rival, servant or equal. The forest, like the storms that swept it, could never be reduced to a single narrative. The duel between the Leshy and Perun, whether as rebellious servant or ally of Veles, represents more than mythic storytelling. It reflects the tension in human life between cultivated order and untamed wildness. Perun symbolized the structured world of law, kingship, and divine authority. The Leshy symbolized the forest, unpredictable, fertile, and dangerous. Their clash was not only cosmic but social, played out in the daily struggle of peasants to balance farming, hunting, and herding with respect for the wilderness around them. Each storm that broke the sky was a reminder that this balance was fragile, that order and chaos were locked in eternal contest. And as these mythic layers deepened, the Leshy's role expanded still further. He was not only entangled with Perun and Veles, but also with a host of other spirits, household guardians, water nymphs, field sprites, figures who shared the Slavic world of folklore. Some were his allies, others his rivals, but together they created a web of relationships that made the unseen world as complex as the human one. To understand the Leshy fully, peasants believed, one had to see him not in isolation, but as part of this larger society of spirits, each with its place, its domain, its trickery, and its power. The Leshy did not haunt the Slavic imagination alone. To the people who told his stories, the world was crowded with spirits, each claiming their own domain, each shaping daily life in ways that could not be ignored. The Leshy belonged to the forest, but alongside him were others who ruled houses, rivers, fields, and marshes. Together, they formed a society of unseen powers, a shadow world that paralleled the human one. In this society, the Leshy was not the absolute master of everything wild, but one figure among many, bound to a network of allies, rivals, and fellow tricksters. His character became clearer when placed among these others, for his role in folklore was shaped not only by his own deeds, but by how he related to them. Perhaps his closest kin in spirit was the domovoi, the household guardian. Where the Leshy ruled the wilderness, the domovoi ruled the home. The two could not be more different in their domains, one presiding over fields and hearths, the other over dark groves, but their roles were strangely parallel. Both demanded respect, both could bless or curse, both punished arrogance and rewarded humility. Villagers often spoke of them in similar terms as masters of their respective realms. Yet the domovoi was a spirit of order, of familiarity, of the controlled environment of human life, while the Leshy embodied the chaos beyond. They were not enemies so much as opposites representing the two poles of existence. The domovoi protected from within, the Leshy threatened from without, and together they explained the full spectrum of experience, from the safety of home to the peril of forest. Rivers and lakes had their own spirits, most famously the Rusalka, the water nymph who lured men to watery deaths. The Leshy and the Rusalka were often imagined as rivals, for their domains touched and overlapped. Forests gave way to rivers, rivers cut through groves, and in these borderlands the spirits could clash. Tales tell of Leshys who drove wanderers to riverbanks where Rusalki waited to finish their work, pulling the victims under. In others, the Leshy fought against the water maidens, trying to reclaim humans lured away from his trees. Some even said the Leshy and the Rusalka could form uneasy alliances, working together to ensnare men, he leading them astray with his tricks, she dragging them into the depths once they reached the water. In these stories, peasants saw reflected the dangerous meeting of two worlds, the wildness of forest and the treachery of water. Another rival was the Polovic, the field spirit. Just as the Leshy ruled the forests, the Polovic ruled the fields, guarding the crops and punishing those who disrespected the land. The two were not always enemies, but their domains were marked by tension. For peasants, the boundary between field and forest was the line between safety and danger, cultivation and wilderness. To imagine spirits ruling both sides of that line made the contrast clearer. The Polovic ensured crops grew and warned against lazy farming. The Leshy tested those who stepped beyond the furrows into the trees. Together, they formed a balance, each limiting the reach of the other. Farmers who honored the Polovic might enjoy good harvests, but they still had to appease the Leshy if their cattle grazed near the tree line. Then there were the tricksters, spirits whose natures mirrored the Leshy's own. Chief among them was the bannock, the bathhouse spirit, notorious for his cruel jokes and sudden violence. Like the Leshy, the bannock thrived in ambiguity, offering protection if honored, but bringing terror if disrespected. The parallels were not accidental. Both spirits embodied liminal spaces, the Leshy in the boundary between field and forest, the bannock in the bathhouse, a place between public and private, clean and unclean. Folklore often grouped them together as dangerous but necessary figures, guardians of thresholds whose tricks reminded humans of their fragility. In some regions, tales even described the Leshy and bannock as companions, delighting in tormenting peasants with their games. Of course, the Leshy also had rivals of more terrifying scale. Chief among them was Vodyanoi, the water spirit often depicted as a monstrous old man dwelling in rivers and ponds. Like the Leshy, he ruled animals, in his case fish, and demanded offerings to allow fishermen success. Some traditions imagined the Leshy and the Vodyanoi in constant struggle, each trying to draw humans into their domains. Others suggested they were allies, two rulers of the natural world who respected each other's boundaries. The ambiguity of their relationship reflected the broader worldview. Spirits were not fixed in friendship or enmity. They shifted as easily as the Leshy himself, allies in one story, rivals in another, always unpredictable. Even within his own forests, the Leshy was not uncontested. Witches, sorcerers, and other spirits moved through the trees, sometimes working with him, sometimes against him. Baba Yaga herself, though usually imagined as dwelling in deeper, stranger woods, could be seen as a figure whose path crossed with his. She was more focused on knowledge, initiation, and power, while he represented wildness and mischief. Yet their similarities made them natural rivals. Both could appear as helpers or destroyers, both tested those who entered their domains, and both blurred the line between spirit and demon after Christianization. In tales where they met, the Leshy often appeared diminished, a lesser trickster compared to her immense authority. But in other accounts, they were equals, two rulers of the wilderness whose influence stretched over different aspects of the unknown. The Leshy's place among these other spirits made him part of a larger spiritual ecology, one in which no being ruled alone. Just as human society was filled with competing interests, neighbors, rulers, rivals, allies, so too was the unseen world. The Leshy was feared not only for his own tricks, but also because he could call upon, clash with, or be aided by others. To enter the forest was not to face a single spirit, but an entire network of unseen forces, each with its own desires. The Leshy might lead you astray, the Rusalka might drown you, the Domovoy might protect you if you had honored him before leaving home. Survival meant navigating not just the trees, but the entire spirit world imagined to inhabit them. This interplay also revealed something about how peasants viewed their environment. The forest was not isolated from the river, nor was the field separate from the home. All were connected, and the spirits reflected this. The Leshy's alliances and rivalries mirrored the way the natural world worked. water feeding fields, fields bordering forests, forests sheltering streams. The unseen beings mapped onto this reality, giving the environment a face and a will. By telling stories of the Leshy's clashes with other spirits, peasants explained the tensions they saw in nature itself. Christianity, of course, tried to simplify this world, reducing all spirits to demons, but the stories resisted simplification. Even when described as devils, the Leshy and his counterparts retained their distinct roles and relationships. The domovoi could not be mistaken for the rusalka, nor the Leshy for the vodyanoi. The old categories remained because they matched lived experience too closely to be erased. The peasants still lived with houses, fields, forests, and rivers, and they still needed spirits to explain the mysteries of each. Through these relationships, the Leshy's own identity sharpened. He was not the lord of all things, but the master of one domain, the forest. His allies and rivals defined his limits, showing that his power was great, but not absolute. To place him among the spirits was to place him in a community, one as fraught and complex as human society. He was feared, respected, tricked, and trickster in turn, bound in a constant dance with others who shared the unseen world. And when we step back to look at these tales, a deeper pattern emerges. The Leshy was not only part of a society of spirits, but also part of human psychology, embodying fears, doubts, and instincts that reached beyond folklore into the structure of the mind itself. To see him only as a trickster among spirits is to miss the archetype he carried, the embodiment of the wild unconscious, the shadow of the forest that mirrored the shadow in the human soul. The peasants who first told stories of the Leshy did not speak of psychology, nor of archetypes, nor of symbols. They spoke of trees that shifted in the wind, of cattle lost at the edge of the forest, of hunters who vanished and never came back. Yet behind these simple tales lies something older and deeper, a pattern recognizable across cultures, the way human beings project the uncertainties of the natural world into figures that reflect their own fears, instincts, and shadowed desires. The Leshy, in this sense, was not only a spirit of the forest, he was a mirror of the human mind, an archetype of the wild, unpredictable forces both outside and within. The forest itself was already a psychological landscape. To walk into it was to step out of order and into chaos. Villages had fences, fields had borders, houses had walls. All of these created a sense of safety and structure. The forest, by contrast, stretched endlessly, filled with shadows, noises, and paths that led nowhere. It demanded alertness, but also overwhelmed the senses. In that environment, the human mind could not help but fill the unknown with meaning. Every rustle was an animal, or was it something else? Every echo was a friend's voice, or was it the Leshy? The spirit embodied the psychological effect of being lost, of doubting perception, of feeling that the world itself was conspiring against you. He was the personification of disorientation. But beyond confusion, the Leshy also embodied what modern psychology would call the shadow, the aspects of the self that are feared, denied, or repressed. He was the uncanny double, the doppelganger, appearing as your friend, your brother, or even yourself. In this, he represented the fear of the other within, the unsettling idea that what we most trust, our loved ones, our own reflection, can betray us. By projecting this fear onto the forest, peasants externalized an inner truth, that the self is not as stable or trustworthy as we like to believe. The Leshy, in taking on familiar forms with one detail wrong, forced people to confront the instability of identity. His shape-shifting, too, carried psychological weight. He was tall as the trees one moment, small as a grass blade the next. This reflected the way the mind perceives danger. In one moment, a threat looms impossibly large, overwhelming. In another, it seems small, almost laughable, until it suddenly returns with new force. The Leshy's mutability mirrored the shifting proportions of fear itself, never constant, always changing, always greater or smaller than reason dictates. To face him was to face the unstable, shifting nature of the human response to the unknown. The Leshy's trickery with sound also carried archetypal resonance. His voice in the trees, calling in familiar tones, embodied the danger of instinctive trust. Humans are wired to respond to voices, especially those we know. To hear one's name spoken is to feel called, compelled. The Leshy used this against them, exploiting the deepest reflexes of human connection. Psychologically, this reflects the vulnerability of the social bond, the way loyalty and recognition can be manipulated. In this sense, the Leshy personified not only the external forest, but also the internal weaknesses of the human mind, its tendency to trust, to follow, to be led astray by what feels familiar. The archetype of the Leshy also connects to the idea of the wilderness as both threat and teacher. In many traditions, journeys into the wild are symbolic of journeys into the unconscious. One enters unfamiliar terrain, confronts dangers, and emerges changed. The Leshy played the role of initiator in such journeys. Some he destroyed, leading them to their deaths. Others he guided, granting them new knowledge or safe passage after testing them. He was not simply a destroyer, but a force of transformation, representing the fact that encounters with the unknown can both harm and enlighten. To peasants, this was not theory, but reality. To enter the forest was to risk destruction, but it was also to gain the resources needed to live. The Leshy, as archetype, was that dual possibility embodied. Another psychological layer emerges in his role as herdsman. To say that he kept animals under his care was not only to explain the movements of beasts, but also to give form to the human struggle with control and instinct. Animals, both wild and domestic, symbolized untamed impulses, hunger, fear, aggression, desire. The Leshy, in commanding them, became master of these forces, suggesting that the wild itself, and by extension the wild within, could not be owned by humans, but only borrowed, negotiated with, temporarily managed. This mirrored the reality of human psychology. Instincts cannot be destroyed, only acknowledged and balanced. The Leshy was the one who reminded peasants of this truth, punishing those who sought to dominate without respect, rewarding those who acknowledged their limits. In his family, too, we see psychological archetypes. The Leshy's wife, sometimes beautiful, sometimes monstrous, reflected the ambivalent nature of desire and fear. She could lure with beauty, representing temptation, or horrify with monstrous form, representing repulsion. His children, mischievous and dangerous, represented the chaos of youth, the unpredictability of untamed potential. Together, the family formed a dark mirror of human households, showing that even kinship and love, the most stabilizing forces of life, had their shadows in the wilderness. What makes the Leshy archetypal is precisely this layering of roles. He was not one thing, but many: trickster, guardian, destroyer, teacher, doppelganger, herdsman. Each role reflected a part of human experience with the unknown: fear, hope, temptation, transformation. He could not be reduced because the forest itself could not be reduced. The mind projects many things onto the darkness between trees, and the Leshy gathered them all into one figure. He was the wild unconscious, the unpredictable shadow, the embodiment of what lies just beyond the safety of the village fence. This explains why he survived Christianization and centuries of reinterpretation. The church could call him a demon, peasants could call him a trickster, modern writers could call him a folkloric relic, but the archetype beneath remained. He filled a role the human mind continually generates, the figure who represents the boundary between order and chaos, self and other, known and unknown. As long as people live near forests or near anything that embodies vastness and uncertainty, figures like the Leshy will arise. He is not only Slavic, he is universal, part of the way humans make sense of the untamed. The archetype also explains why he is both feared and respected. Purely evil figures can be rejected, purely good ones can be worshipped. But figures like the Leshy persist because they embody ambiguity. They cannot be dismissed because they represent something real, the unpredictability of life itself. To fear him is to fear chaos, but to respect him is to acknowledge its necessity. Without the forest, there is no fuel, no animals, no survival. Without chaos, there is no growth, no change. The Leshy as archetype forces recognition of this truth. And so, when peasants told stories of him, they were not only warning their children of dangers in the woods, they were giving voice to the deeper fears and instincts of human life, embodying in the figure of the Leshy the things they could not control, the things they both needed and dreaded. He was the forest, yes, but he was also the mind's own darkness, the shadow that walks beside us, sometimes as a friend, sometimes as an enemy, never entirely one or the other. From here, the symbolism of the Leshy becomes even clearer when we consider him not only as a psychological archetype, but as a symbol, an emblem of wildness, of freedom, of the untamed forces that exist both outside and within human life. His image carried meaning beyond fear, standing for the very idea of what it means to live beside the forest and to confront the unknown. The Leshy was not just a character in stories told by firesides or warnings whispered to children. He became a symbol, a figure who condensed into himself everything the untamed forest meant to the Slavic imagination. Symbols live deeper than words. They take hold of fears, hopes, and instincts, giving them a shape that can be remembered and shared. The Leshy was such a symbol, embodying the wilderness in all its danger and necessity, a reminder that the world outside the fields could not be controlled or possessed. He stood for the untamed, and through him the peasants expressed truths about their relationship with nature, society, and even themselves. At the most immediate level, the Leshy represented the forest itself. Every tree, every shadow, every animal movement belonged to him. To walk into the woods was to walk into his body, his thoughts, his domain. This made him a living symbol of the wilderness, a way of making the vast, chaotic, unpredictable environment into something that could be spoken of, warned against, even bargained with. A faceless forest is too abstract to fear, but a spirit with a laugh, a shadow, a trickster's smile is unforgettable. By turning the forest into the Leshy, peasants gave it a voice and a personality, a presence that explained its dangers in terms the human mind could grasp. He also symbolized freedom, but not the comfortable kind. The Leshy's freedom was wild, unbounded, dangerous. He shifted shapes at will, appearing as man, beast, or giant. He walked without roads, lived without huts, obeyed no master. This made him both terrifying and enviable. Peasants lived bound by necessity, crops to tend, animals to feed, seasons to obey, taxes to pay. The Leshy, by contrast, embodied a life outside all such structures. He was lawless, untamed, beholden to no authority. To imagine him was to imagine what it might mean to escape the weight of order, to live as free as the forest itself. Of course, this freedom was double-edged. It meant unpredictability, danger, and the constant threat of destruction. But it was freedom nonetheless, and in him peasants saw both the temptation and the terror of stepping beyond human limits. The Leshy also represented boundaries, both their necessity and their fragility. He appeared at crossroads, at tree lines, at thresholds. He was strongest in liminal spaces, the edges where categories blurred. Symbolically, this made him a reminder that no border is absolute. Villages could build fences, but beyond them the forest remained. Religion could declare spirits demons, but the old beliefs still lived. Humans could trust their eyes and ears, but the Leshy could make them betray their senses.
Every limit people tried to impose was challenged by him, making him a symbol of the instability of human order. He embodied the truth that boundaries can be crossed, twisted, or erased at any time.
As keeper of animals, he symbolized the wildness within the natural order. Domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats might graze peacefully near the village, but their origins were wild, and their ultimate belonging was to the forest. The Leshy's theft of cattle or scattering of herds was not only mischief, but a symbolic reminder that domestication was temporary, that wildness could reclaim what humans thought they owned. His herds of invisible deer and unseen wolves roaming the trees stood for the untamed abundance of nature existing beyond human control. In this way, he was the living symbol of nature's autonomy, its refusal to be entirely mastered. His role as trickster gave him another layer of symbolism. Tricksters across cultures represent the instability of truth, the danger of appearances, the fragility of perception. The Leshy, with his mimicry and disguises, symbolized precisely this. He stood for the fact that the world is not always what it seems, that certainty can dissolve in an instant. To meet him was to confront the symbolic truth that reality is unstable, that trust can be misplaced, that the familiar can turn alien. This made him a powerful emblem of disorientation, a symbol of how easily humans can be led astray when they rely too heavily on senses or assumptions. On a deeper level, the Leshy symbolized the human relationship to the unknown. The forest was vast, mysterious, and often deadly, but it was also necessary.
Without it, there was no fuel, no game, no foraging. The Leshy, as its personification, carried both aspects. He punished arrogance but rewarded respect. He destroyed some but guided others. He symbolized the double truth of the unknown. It is dangerous, but it is also the source of life. To honor him was to admit this reality, to accept that survival depended not on domination, but on humility before what cannot be controlled. The Leshy's family extended these symbols further. His wife, sometimes beautiful, sometimes monstrous, symbolized the ambivalence of desire and fear, the way nature can lure and repel at once. His children, mischievous and wild, symbolized untamed potential, both playful and destructive. Together, the household symbolized the forest as a living family, not empty wilderness, but a parallel society with its own rules, quarrels, and powers. By giving the forest a family, peasants expressed its fullness, its complexity, its refusal to be reduced to a single image. In Christian times, his symbolism shifted, but did not disappear. As a demon, he came to represent temptation, sin, and the dangers of straying from the true path. His tricks were no longer lessons but lures into damnation. Yet even here, the underlying symbols persisted. He still represented the forest, the unknown, the untamed. The church could change his interpretation, but it could not erase his meaning.
To peasants, he continued to embody the truths of the wilderness, even when wrapped in the language of sin. Modern interpretations see the Leshy as symbolizing the ecological relationship between humans and the natural world. He embodies the truth that nature is not passive, not an object to be exploited without consequence, but an active presence that demands respect. His punishments for greed and his rewards for humility reflect ecological balance, the recognition that to live in harmony with the environment requires restraint. In this sense, the Leshy's symbolism continues to speak, reminding us of truths that are as urgent now as they were centuries ago. What makes him enduring as a symbol is his refusal to be fixed. He is not simply good or evil, protector or destroyer, guardian or demon. He is all of these at once, shifting as the forest shifts, as human perception shifts. This fluidity makes him the perfect emblem of the untamed. He cannot be domesticated, even in story. He resists reduction, just as the wild resists control. In this way, he continues to carry meaning, not only for the peasants who first told his tales, but for anyone who confronts the unknown and feels its vast, unpredictable power. And so, through the Leshy, we see not only a spirit of the forest, but a symbol of the wild itself: freedom, danger, ambiguity, necessity. He was never just a trickster to frighten children. He was, and remains, an emblem of what it means to live at the edge of the untamed. From here, the stories of the Leshy begin to move beyond symbol into comparison, as we see him alongside similar figures in the folklore of other cultures: wild men, forest guardians, tricksters who reveal that the archetype of the untamed is not unique to Slavic lands but universal across the human imagination.
For all his symbolism, the Leshy was not an abstract figure to the people who told his stories. He was immediate, practical, a presence that demanded action. Peasants did not merely speak of him as a myth, they lived with him as a danger and a necessity, shaping their behavior in countless ways. The Leshy existed not only in tales but in rituals, in small gestures of respect and protection carried out whenever people approached the forest. To understand him fully, we must look at how survival in the wild meant surviving him, and how peasants developed a set of customs, part superstition, part ritual, part folk knowledge, that framed every encounter with the woods. The simplest and most widespread of these acts were offerings. Before entering the forest, peasants often left bread, salt, or vodka at stumps or crossroads. These were not grand sacrifices, but small tokens, the kind of things every household possessed, humble gifts meant to acknowledge the master of the forest and ask for safe passage. Salt, in particular, carried weight, as it was both precious and symbolic of preservation. Vodka, too, was common in offerings, poured onto the ground to please the Leshy, who was said to enjoy its fiery strength. Bread, the staple of life, was given as a gesture of respect. These acts reflected the belief that one did not enter the forest empty-handed, but as a guest in another's domain, and guests must bring gifts. Protection also took the form of clothing and gestures.
One of the most widespread customs was to turn garments inside out before venturing into the woods. This simple inversion was believed to confuse the Leshy, disrupting his tricks and preventing him from leading travelers astray. Some tied their belts the wrong way or switched their shoes onto the opposite feet, creating the same kind of disorientation that the Leshy himself employed. The logic was clear. By mimicking confusion, by embodying inversion, one could throw the Leshy off balance, turning his own tricks against him. Curses were another tool. Peasants often warned each other never to answer if they heard their name called in the woods, for it was likely the Leshy's voice. But if one did hear it, the safest response was to curse loudly, using foul or blasphemous language. The Leshy, like many spirits, was said to shrink from strong words, unable to tolerate open insult. To call him names, to invoke God's power, or to hurl obscenities could break his hold and drive him away. In this sense, profanity, often frowned upon in the village, became a weapon in the forest. Iron was also considered protective. Just as it repelled witches and other spirits, so too was it believed to ward off the Leshy. Carrying an axe, a knife, or even a small nail could give travelers a sense of security. These tools were not only practical for survival, but talismans of human order, shaped by fire and craft, set against the wildness of the woods. To hold iron was to hold a fragment of civilization, a reminder that man was not entirely powerless in the face of the untamed. Rituals extended to herding and hunting as well. Shepherds, before leading their flocks near the tree line, sometimes drew protective signs with knives or sprinkled holy water. Others tied red threads around the necks of cattle, a color believed to confuse or repel spirits. Hunters, before entering the forest, whispered prayers or crossed themselves, blending Christian ritual with older customs of offering bread and vodka. Even after Christianization, the two systems overlapped. A man might leave bread at a stump and then pray to St. Nicholas for safe passage, not seeing any contradiction. Survival demanded flexibility, and peasants used every tool they had, old and new alike. There were also more elaborate rituals for those who believed they had angered the Leshy. If cattle vanished or hunters failed repeatedly, villagers sometimes performed appeasement ceremonies. Bread, salt, and alcohol would be gathered and placed at the forest edge, accompanied by whispered apologies or chants. In some cases, entire households participated, treating the act almost like a community offering. These rituals reinforced the idea that the Leshy's wrath was not only an individual problem, but a communal threat. If the forest spirit was displeased, everyone might suffer through lost livestock or poor hunts, and so everyone had a stake in restoring balance.
Certain taboos also governed behavior in the woods. One of the most common was never to whistle. Whistling, peasants said, called the Leshy's attention, summoning him like an invitation. Children were especially warned against this, told that if they whistled, the Leshy would hear and come running. Another taboo was never to sleep on a stump or in a clearing. These places were said to belong to him, and to rest there was to risk being taken. Some also avoided eating or drinking in the woods, believing that consuming food without an offering left one vulnerable. The forest was not a place for casual behavior. It was sacred, dangerous, and demanded constant vigilance. Interestingly, some regions even developed rituals for making direct bargains with the Leshy. A hunter desperate for game might go to a crossroads at midnight with bread and vodka, calling the Leshy's name and asking for aid. If the spirit appeared, the hunter could negotiate, offering a share of his catch or even years of service in exchange for success. Such rituals were dangerous, for the Leshy was an unpredictable bargainer, and to make promises one could not keep was to invite ruin. Yet desperation often drove men to risk them, for the line between survival and starvation was thin. Children, too, were given rituals of protection. Parents taught them to keep small charms, crosses, bits of iron, even herbs believed to ward off spirits.
They were warned never to follow voices or companions they met in the forest, always to stay within sight of others. In this way, folklore became practical education, teaching survival through story and ritual. To speak of the Leshy was to teach caution, and to practice rituals was to embody that lesson. The blending of Christian and older practices is particularly striking. Villagers might cross themselves and recite prayers, but they still turned clothing inside out, cursed when hearing voices, and left bread at stumps. Christianity could not erase the older patterns because they were woven into daily survival. Priests condemned such acts as superstition, but for peasants, they were simply common sense. The Leshy was not an abstract devil, but a lived presence, and no sermon could change the fact that people continued to vanish in the forest. Rituals persisted because they worked, not in the sense of magically controlling spirits, but in the sense of giving people a framework for action in the face of uncertainty. Even the smallest gestures carried weight. A man walking into the forest might casually drop crumbs of bread behind him, not only to mark his path, but also to placate the Leshy. A woman gathering herbs might hum softly, not just to pass time, but to keep the spirit's mimicry at bay. These actions became second nature, unspoken rituals woven into daily life. They reveal how deeply the Leshy was embedded in the peasant worldview, not as a story told once in a while, but as a constant presence requiring constant response. In the end, these rituals and protections did not remove the Leshy from life. They acknowledged him, honored him, and gave people a way to live with him. The forest could not be banished, nor could the spirit who ruled it. But through offerings, inversions, curses, iron, and prayer, peasants carved out a fragile safety, a way to step into the untamed without surrendering entirely. The rituals were not about conquering the Leshy, but about coexisting with him, surviving alongside his unpredictable power. And this survival shaped not only old life, but new, For the Leshy did not remain confined to the village edge. In later times, as stories spread, as literature and art took hold, he began to move into new forms, appearing in books, plays, and eventually modern media. His rituals became stories, his offerings became symbols, and his protections became elements of fantasy worlds far beyond the Slavic forest.
The Leshy was once a figure spoken of in whispers at the edge of the forest, a presence explained in simple terms of cattle lost, hunters gone astray, or children tricked by voices in the trees. But stories do not remain bound to their origins. They travel, they adapt, they evolve with the cultures that tell them. Over time, the Leshy slipped out of the mouths of peasants and into the pens of writers, the canvases of artists, and eventually the vast machinery of modern entertainment. In doing so, he transformed again, becoming not only a spirit of survival, but a figure of imagination, a symbol carried forward into new worlds where the forest still haunts human thought. His first journey into wider culture came through folklore collectors in the 18th and 19th centuries. Just as the Brothers Grimm preserved German tales, Russian and Slavic scholars gathered stories of the Leshy, writing down the oral traditions that had circulated for centuries. For peasants, these stories were practical, tied to survival. For educated readers, they became curiosities, glimpses into the soul of the people. The Leshy was no longer just a spirit of the woods, but a literary character, presented as evidence of Slavic culture's richness and depth. These collections fixed him in writing, spreading him beyond the villages where he had once been most feared. In this new setting, the Leshy's image began to shift.
Writers and poets emphasized his strangeness and his ambiguity, sometimes portraying him as a comical trickster, other times as a terrifying demon. The Romantic movement, with its fascination for nature and the wild, found him particularly alluring. Poets imagined him striding through dark groves, a symbol of the forest's mystery and power. Painters depicted him as a towering giant or a moss-covered man, blending into the landscape he ruled. Through art and literature, he became a cultural emblem, not only of superstition, but of the wild itself. By the 19th century, the Leshy had entered Russian and Slavic literature more broadly. Authors used him as a metaphor for the unpredictable power of nature, or as a character who embodied the conflict between civilization and wilderness. Sometimes he appeared as a comical figure, bumbling and mischievous, a rustic echo of trickster archetypes found across the world. Other times he appeared as a sinister demon, a reminder of the old beliefs that Christianity had tried to erase. Each retelling reshaped him, but all retained the essence of his ambiguity. He was never only one thing, never entirely benevolent or malevolent, always unpredictable. The 20th century brought further transformation. As folklore became part of national identity, the Leshy was reclaimed as a distinctly Slavic figure, a symbol of cultural heritage. He appeared in children's stories and fairy tales, softened into a more approachable figure who still played tricks but no longer destroyed. He was sometimes presented almost as a rustic guardian, a forest grandfather who protected animals from human greed. This domestication of the Leshy reflected the needs of modern culture, to preserve tradition without terrifying children, to turn dark folklore into something that could be celebrated rather than feared. Yet, alongside this softer image, darker versions persisted. Scholars and artists interested in the occult, the esoteric or the Gothic, revived the more menacing Leshy, emphasizing his role as deceiver, demon, and double. In literature and theatre, he appeared as a shadowy figure who embodied temptation, chaos, and the breakdown of identity. For modern readers living in cities far from the dangers of the old forests, he became less a practical warning and more a symbol of psychological fear, the loss of self, the instability of reality, the lure of the unknown. As fantasy literature grew in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Leshy found new life. Writers of folklore-inspired fantasy drew on him as a ready-made character, the shape-shifting forest guardian, the trickster spirit, the ambiguous force of wildness. He began appearing in novels, role-playing games, and eventually video games, each time reshaped for new audiences. In some, he was monstrous, a boss enemy to be defeated, towering and terrifying, a demon of the forest. In others, he was more sympathetic, a neutral or even protective figure, embodying the idea of balance with nature. His ambiguity allowed him to fit many roles, making him a flexible figure for modern storytelling. The most famous modern appearance of the Leshy is perhaps in video games inspired by Slavic folklore, where he has become an iconic monster. Here he is often imagined as a massive antlered being, half human, half tree, a creature blending flesh and forest. This image, though different from peasant tales, captures the essence of his symbolism. He is the forest given form, a living embodiment of the wild. Players fear him not only for his power, but for his unpredictability, echoing the same themes that peasants once whispered by their firesides. The Leshy's survival in modern fantasy shows how adaptable he is, able to move from oral tale to high technology without losing his core identity. Cinema and television have also drawn on him, though often indirectly. The archetype of the forest spirit, the shapeshifter, the deceiver, owes much to him even when not named directly. Films that show the forest as alive, as hostile, as filled with voices and doubles, are echoing the same fears that once gave rise to the Leshy. In some works of Slavic-inspired fantasy, he appears outright, a strange figure lurking among trees, his laughter inhuman, his power vast. In others, his presence is subtler, woven into the atmosphere of the untamed forest. What is striking is how consistently the same traits recur, even in modern reimaginings. He is still a shapeshifter. He still uses voice and mimicry. He still rules animals and punishes arrogance. He still represents the ambiguity of nature, dangerous but necessary, destructive but essential. Whether as a monstrous boss fight, a kindly forest grandfather, or a poetic symbol of the wild, the Leshy carries the same symbolic weight he did centuries ago. His forms change, but his essence remains. The modern world, though vastly different from the villages where his tales began, still needs figures like the Leshy. The forest may no longer threaten daily survival, but the unknown still does. Psychological fears, ecological anxieties, and the fascination with what lies beyond human control all find a ready image in him. He is not confined to the past, but continues to adapt, speaking to new generations in new ways. In him, we see how folklore never dies, but transforms, carrying forward the same archetypal truths in new forms. And so, from whispered warnings at the forest edge to novels, paintings, and video games, the Leshy endures. He has become a bridge between past and present, tradition and imagination, folklore and fantasy. To encounter him in modern culture is to see how deeply the untamed still lives in us, how we still crave figures that embody the wild, the free, the unpredictable. He was once the shadow at the tree line. Now he is also the shadow in our media, our stories, our games, our art. And through all these transformations, he still stands as what he has always been, the forest itself, laughing, shifting, reminding us that wildness never disappears. From here, his story carries us into its final current, not as a figure confined to old lore or modern fantasy, but as an eternal presence, the guardian of boundaries and wildness, still haunting imagination long after his forests have been tamed.
The Leshy began as a whisper at the tree line, a presence explained in stories told by those who lived closest to the wilderness. He was the reason hunters lost their way, the reason cattle strayed into the forest, the reason voices called where no one stood. For peasants he was real not because he could be seen, but because his presence explained what was otherwise unexplainable. Yet the Leshy never stayed confined to these villages. He grew, shifted, adapted. He became a demon in Christian tales, a character in romantic poetry, a figure in folklore collections, a monster in games, a guardian in stories of ecological balance. Through all of these transformations, he never disappeared. He survived because he filled a role no other figure could. He stood for the eternal presence of the wild, the reminder that no matter how much humans tame the world, there will always be something untamed just beyond their reach. Why does he still haunt us? Perhaps because the wild itself still haunts us. The old forests may have been cut back, the wolves driven out, the cattle guarded by fences, but the human relationship to the untamed has not ended. It has only changed. The wilderness now is not always a dark forest, but the vastness of oceans, the cold of mountains, the shifting chaos of the climate, even the unexplored corners of the mind. In each of these, the same archetype lurks, something unpredictable, something that resists control, something that refuses to be reduced to order.
The Leshy is that archetype given a name, a voice, and a face. And as long as humans wrestle with the unknown, figures like him will remain. The Leshy also persists because he embodies ambiguity in a way few figures do. He is not only destroyer, not only guardian, not only trickster, not only demon. He is all of these at once depending on the story, the teller, the moment. This ambiguity makes him alive. A figure that is only evil becomes predictable. A figure that is only good becomes safe. But the Leshy resists. He is sometimes helpful, sometimes cruel, sometimes comical, sometimes terrifying. He shifts as the forest shifts, and in doing so, he remains relevant. He is not fixed to one meaning, but to the broader truth of unpredictability itself. In him, people also see the shadow of themselves, his mimicry, his doubling, his tricks with voices and reflections. These are not only about the forest, they are about the instability of identity, the way the self can become strange, the way trust can falter. He embodies not just the fear of being lost in the woods, but the fear of being lost in oneself. This psychological resonance keeps him alive even for those who no longer live near great forests. The Leshy is the forest, but he is also the shadow of the human mind, and both remain as untamed as ever. Modern culture returns to him again and again because he is a figure of resistance against control. In a world that increasingly seeks to map, measure, and dominate every aspect of life, the Leshy reminds us that some things cannot be mapped, measured, or dominated. He stands for the limits of human authority, the stubborn persistence of freedom in its rawest form. Whether he is feared as a monster, laughed at as a trickster, or respected as a guardian, he always reminds us that the wild endures. This is why the Leshy haunts us still. Not as a relic of folklore, not as a curiosity preserved in books, but as a living figure who adapts to each age. For peasants, he was a daily danger at the forest edge. For Christians, he was a demon testing the faithful. For romantics, he was a poetic symbol of nature's mystery. For modern audiences, he is a creature of fantasy, a mythological guardian, a reminder of ecological truth. In each form, he carries the same essence. The wild cannot be erased, only transformed. And so, the Leshy remains. His laughter is still heard in the rustle of leaves, his tricks still felt in the confusion of paths, his presence still alive in the stories we tell of the unknown. He is eternal not because he never changes, but because he always does, shifting with the needs of the people who imagine him. He is the guardian of boundaries, the ruler of herds, the master of mimicry, the forest given flesh. And as long as humans live with the untamed, outside and within, he will remain beside us, haunting, teaching, tricking, reminding us that the world is never fully ours to command. The Leshy still waits at the crossroads, still hides at the tree line, still calls from the depths of the forest. He has never left, because the untamed has never left. And so his story continues, not as an ending, but as an eternal presence, a figure who will always walk just beyond the line of firelight, laughing softly, watching, reminding us that the wild is never gone.